Video 3.1, Week 3 Context.
Hello everyone and welcome to the contextual video for week 3. In this video we'll be looking at the focus for this week's work as well as identifying some key questions to consider as we move forward. The focus of the video is on the planning and preparation phase of the design cycle. The questions that will guide us today are: what is the design cycle? What are the components of an action plan? What are design goals and how are they impacted by constraints and barriers? And what are the design resources and assets that you have available to you? Finally, we'll look at what tools you should be using in your work. The first question to think about is, what is the design cycle? In the context of this class, the design cycle is divided into 5 stages: the planning stage, the curation stage, the creation stage, the composition stage, and the critique stage. It's important to note that each of these stages are involved in a process that is ongoing, and so you may end up being in one stage more than once. When we look at the first stage, the planning stage, this is the stage where you're going to be defining the design problem, articulating the design goals for solving the problem, and breaking the design problem into different deliverables or tasks that need to be completed. The last thing that you'll be doing in this stage is assigning a timeline for each of the phases of the project. This is a very important component because it will help you in managing your workflow. The second stage of the design cycle is the curating stage. In this stage, we're going to review the resources that are available to help us solve the design problem. These resources could include knowledge resources, tutorials, tools, or existing assets that we can then use. It's an essential component of the design process because in the curating stage, essentially what you're doing is collecting and organizing all of the resources that you're going to be using in your design work. The third phase of the design cycle is the creation stage. This is the fun stage. This is where you start to make your artifact come to life. It may begin with sketching and rough drafts of your design assets, which are then edited and finalized for composition. This can include creating illustrations, audio clips, video clips, or animations. It's different from the composition stage in that the creation stage, you are essentially creating a library of assets that you're going to use in your project. These assets will then be put together or composed in the next stage. As noted, the fourth stage of the design cycle is the composition stage. This is where things really start to come together and involves you putting together each of the design assets in order to come up with the final product. In this stage, your primary focus will be on making media accessible and giving consideration to the types of formats and accessible assets that you're going to be using in the final product. You're also going to want to check for the continuity of the artifact as well as assess your use of the design principles. The fifth and final stage of the design cycle is the sharing and critique stage. This is where things start to get interesting. This is the stage where you share your artifact with others in order to get feedback. This can be with other designers, families, friends, the client with whom you're working with. And the purpose here is for you to collect feedback so you can start to figure out what's working in your design. What are the things that people are really impressed by? You also need to be able to identify what's not working, what needs to be taken out of the design. And then finally, what can be left into the design but perhaps needs to be improved or tweaked a little bit. Once you've received critique on the work, you should review your plan of action and see if you've met each of your design goals and make revisions are necessary. Once the revisions are made, which can involve going back and curating, creating, and composing again, it's time for another round of sharing and critique. So, as you can see, this is a process of lather, rinse, and repeat, which you will experience on an ongoing fashion. We talk about each of the stages of the design cycle as we will progress in the course. As noted, the first stage of the design cycle involves planning and preparation. This is perhaps the most important stage of the design process because It establishes the workflow for your project, which leads to the question, what are the components of an action plan? When you're developing an action plan, you are establishing the process for achieving your design goals. As with many other aspects of design, a plan of action will be unique to the design problem. Not all plans of action will be the same. However, a plan of action should contain the following characteristics. It should determine what the design problem is. It should also articulate the goals for solving the design problem, as well as give some consideration to the barriers or constraints that you're going to be working with. These can be things such as time or the availability of different mediums, which brings us to the next question. What are the mediums that you're going to be using in the design? You should be defining this in the planning stages. Are you going to be creating illustrations, making multimedia videos, perhaps making animations? All of these things need to be articulated in the planning stage, not necessarily later. The third thing to think about, the fifth thing to think about is what is the timeline that you're going to be working with for the design artifact. The timeline is an essential component of the planning and preparation because it establishes when things need to happen. Now, depending on the scale of the design problem, it may also be necessary for you to subdivide the design problems into smaller stages where specific deliverables are identified and assigned a specific date. Here's an example. If you were creating a video, you would need to lay out the storyboard for the video, capture the raw footage for the video, edit the footage for the video, then format and compose the footage for the video, and add in additional design elements such as motion graphics, music, animation, narration, etc. In this regard, the design plan is critical because it helps establish a framework for how the work is going to be achieved. My advice here is to do what's referred to as reverse planning. Start with the last thing that you need to complete and work your way backwards. This provides an opportunity to think deeply about the design problem and articulate ways in which it can be solved. The next thing to think about is what are design goals and how are they impacted by the constraints and barriers that you're going to experience in your design problem. As with other aspects of the design cycle, the specific nature of design goals will be contextual and relate to the design problem. However, design goals are often articulated as wants. You'll often hear people say that they want the artifact to be fun, engaging, interactive, or look really nice or professional. While these are highly subjective, they provide insight into the wants for the project. And it's important to note that what is consistent here is to focus on the design goals and the experience that the user will have, rather than on the content or form of the artifact itself. The challenge arises when we start to think about things like, what does it mean to say something is interactive? And what are the different elements that could interfere with that level of interactivity? We're going to explore this a little bit more in the example or case study video for this week, which is the billboard example. So I'd like you to make sure that you take a look at watching that to see how our ability to overcome barriers will depend on whether or not we can think creatively about design problems, as well as what design resources we have available to us to use. This leads to the question of how could this be achieved? What are your design resources and assets? Design resources and assets are divided generally into three categories, which include tools, knowledge, or objects that can be used to help in the design. I'm going to talk about the first one, tools. Design tools usually refers to things that can be used in the creation of artifacts. This can include both hardware and software, laptops, tablets, or software such as Photoshop, Final Cut Pro, Illustrator, etc. Knowledge resources include what the individual already knows, as well as what other people may know and be able to share in relation to the design problem. Having a supportive design community or knowledge community on which you can draw solutions from and share your work with is an essential part of working on design. The key point here is that designers don't work in isolation. The third element of design resources and assets are the actual assets themselves, which may have already been created by yourself or by others, or need to be created. This can include a variety of things such as file types, images, icons, stock photographs, motion graphics, etc. An important thing to note here is that if you are using resources that you have not created yourself, it is always important to look at copyright and licensing for those works, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Keep in mind that developing resources takes time, and we will discuss this further in the curating stage of the course. What is important to note is that this is an ongoing process, which requires the designer to continually seek and explore new ways of designing things. In essence, the design, as with learning, you will be doing continuously. Another question that commonly comes up is, what utilities or tools should you be using in your design work? Students are always asking about the best application for a specific problem. So when researching this, keep in mind that there are a variety of tools that are specifically designed for a variety of purposes. Each individual will have tools that they like and use each tool for a specific job. Not every tool will be for everyone. In this course, we have a design resource database, which includes a list of resources that can be used in your work. There's also a resource database form, which has been provided so that you can share your resources with others. What I'd like to point out, though, is that as you explore these different tools, there are learning curves for each application, and you should choose wisely. The tool should be appropriate for the job, and it should also be within the context of your level of comfort. Make sure that you're picking a software that you're actually interested in and capable of using, not something that just you are going to use because everybody else is using it. As you move forward in the planning and preparation phase, you should give consideration to some of the following questions. Actually, give consideration to all of them. The first one is, what knowledge and experience is going to be needed in order for you to accomplish or achieve your design goals? The second thing that you need to consider is, what are the utilities that you are going to need in your work? As we mentioned, there are a variety of different applications that can be used for a variety of different purposes. Don't stretch yourself too thin here. Don't try and learn every program imaginable. Pick the things that are useful for what you're doing and try to teach yourself how to use that. The third question to think about is, how does your plan of action integrate with your life? I've mentioned this previously. This is very important. You need to take consideration of how your school life, your personal life, and your professional life will impact your ability to complete your responsibilities in this course. This will make your work more enjoyable and meaningful and help keep you organized throughout the next 12 weeks.